And welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn Podcast. I am your host, Michael Grace. Today, we are going to talk to the founder and CTO of a company called 3Forge. If you want to follow along at home, that web address is the number 3 FORGE.com, 3Forge. Robert Cooke is our guest. He's the founder and CTO of 3Forge, a tech company that works with IoT or Internet of Things applications to provide data aggregation and modeling solutions. 3Forge is currently utilized by one of the world's largest crypto platforms, as well as ranking number 1 in data management for financial institutions. In addition, 3Forge is currently used by 3 of the world's 5 largest banks. With nearly 2 decades of experience in IT, Robert has a wealth of knowledge across the industry. And we're going to cover a variety of different topics. I like to clarify all these terms that we're using. So if you're kind of like, ooh, I don't know what IoT is and such, don't worry, hang on, we'll get to all that. So Robert, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Cool. So what maybe help me define Internet of Things to folks that are like, what are those things of the internet that you speak of?
Isn't it self-explanatory? Yeah, well, the way I look at it, Internet of Things, and maybe I take a little bit more of a techie perspective on this, but you have more and more devices that are out in the world that people don't necessarily think of as computers, but they really are computers. They have microprocessors, they're hooked up to the internet, they're consuming information about the world around them and then pushing that information into, I guess, what you could call the web, to use simple terms. It's kind of like if you go back, I think there was a Simpsons episode where like the microwave and the refrigerator and all those things are like starting to like hack into the web. It's like that's really the idea, that all of your devices and everything you're doing is now becoming integrated with the web. And so this ends up creating just a huge wealth of information. And every time you have more information, that's more opportunities to do interesting stuff.
Awesome. I love that explanation, right? It's real. I often tell people when they ask, like, what is this Internet of Things? I'm like, have you bought any smart appliances recently? Right?
Exactly.
Do you have an iRobot? Like I have an iRobot and I can start it from my phone, which means it itself is connected to the internet. And through wireless, right, I can communicate with it. It tells me when the bag is full. It gives me all this great information. My stove, my dishwasher, probably far too many of my darn appliances are connected as Internet of Things devices. It's very cool. So when we look at 3Forge, talk to me a little bit about what 3Forge does. And as the founder, what I like to always ask is, like, what need did you see that you felt like, man, I got to create a company and bring it to market to help companies with this?
Right. So my whole life, I've been really interested in computers, really even before I understood what a computer was. I had just seen them on TV and kind of like there were these magical boxes that could do crazy things. And then, I finally got a computer and got to really sink my teeth into it in the 80s. And I just became fascinated pretty early on with what it meant to have users interact with data. And, back in the 80s, early 90s, there wasn't really, the government had a lot of data, but a lot of people didn't really know about what was available, and it was hard to get to this, and it was in drips and drabs, but even then I was really asking the question of what does it mean for humans to interact with data, and the reverse of that, data, how does it influence humans? And so it really has been a lifelong passion of mine to think about what that is. And when we talk about the Internet of Things, I think that's just one piece of the puzzle. There's also, once you start to get into finance, which is another big part of, that really is, most of our customers are in finance or cryptocurrency, something along those lines. When you really start to get into this, first off, finance, everyone knows in finance, there's a lot of information, and the more information you have, the more power you have in terms of being able to influence people's decisions and frankly, predict people's decisions. And what I think has been very interesting about this as well is we live in the age of electronic decision making. So I'll go back to your your vacuum cleaner for a second here. I mean, there's one thing which is you can interact with your I'm just picking on your vacuum cleaner. I'm sure
Sure,
all
that's
of
all
your
right.
other appliances, I hope they're not hurt. I'm not talking about those two, but because they're probably listening to this as well.
I'm
But
sure.
the refrigerator is gonna be shedding a tear here. Feel left out. No, but in any case, the vacuum cleaner. There's two parts to this. One is you can interact with your vacuum cleaner and see if it's on and off. But I think what's a subtle and untold piece of this is that vacuum cleaner, if it's doing its job correctly, should actually be reporting back on the paths it's taking and the decisions it's making around vacuuming your room. And then that should be analyzed at the end of the day and cross compared with other people. And then they should be looking at your user feedback and all of these things. So my point is, what's interesting about this problem is the more we make everything electronic and connected, not only does that mean humans can directly interact with it, but it also means more information is being generated by the devices themselves as they do more complicated things, right? So we're living in this logarithmic, I would say this exponentially growing data problem. And so really what 3Forge has been all about is how do you let humans consume and interact with data? And, now that term data I use loosely because data often drives very physical things like your car and stuff like that. So that's at a high level what I have focused on.
I love it. Like I use the term, right, and have been quoted as saying the last decade was about collecting data, right? We were all about data warehouses and data lakes and data storage and data oceans. And we had all these fancy terms for collecting data. And I was kind of like, so what? Right? Like, what are we doing with the data is where I think this decade is really pivoting to, right? Is great. You've collected it. Now let's do something meaningful with the data. Let's act on the data or let it influence us. And then again, this is what IT does, right? Is we create all these cool, silly acronyms and terms, data-driven decisions, right? Data-driven decision making becomes something. And I'm like, really? Is it really data-driven? Or, is it like you're getting a report? Because to me, data should drive decisions at a point of immediacy, right? Like when it's happening, and in the financial sector, that's been in play for a while, right? like you swipe your ATM card and it immediately instantly knows, right, who you are, what you just transacted on, and interacts with your funds available instantly, so that if you went next door or went to the next ATM, your balance reflects, what just happened, for instance. It knows when you travel out of the country, right? It knows financial sector seems to be so far ahead of other industries as far as the immediacy of how they deal with data.
I absolutely agree with that, but it's not coincidental. I mean,
Right.
if you really think about where computers first found their home, I would say maybe you could say it was the military and things along those lines. But shortly thereafter, it was certainly for enterprise businesses, and who more likely to start using this than banks. So banks have been using computers for as long as they possibly, as long as computers have been a viable solution. And so they're just ahead of the game. And in fact, I look at it, I think a lot of other industries could stand to learn a lot by looking at the ups and downs and mistakes and corrections that have been made in the financial industry. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there's very specialized software sitting behind these banks to basically allow for this information to be kept in real time and to be updated immediately as you move, from brick and mortar to brick and mortar. Yes, it will still have that information, and there's been a lot that's gone into that. But like I said, I find it fascinating because when I look at the decisions and things in places that banks are in, and then you start to look at where other industries are, I can just feel that those industries are going to be in these same places soon enough. And you talked about the data lake, data ocean, data river, whatever you want it to be. And I think the interesting thing is, and the data ocean, almost the name when you think about it, or data lake, is this idea that you put all the data in one spot. But if you actually really even just think about that analogy, it's yes, you can put all the water into a lake, but it's actually very hard to then find that water and get it back out. So it actually comes down to this bigger problem of when you put the data in, how do you organize it so that it can be retrieved in a useful way? And I think a lot of time and effort has been lost because of just focusing on how do we get the data into one place as opposed to how do we keep it in a meaningful and organized fashion so we can pull it out. I'm a hardcore engineer. I've been writing code my whole life, and I have a few sayings. And one of my favorite sayings is, and I've written a lot of data structures. It is very easy to insert data. It's much more difficult to query data, and it's more difficult than that to update it, and it's very difficult to delete it. That's the order of complexity in a very broad spectrum. So we seem to focus a lot on the inserting of data, and frankly, that's the easy part. It's actually how do you get that data out? How do you mutate that data? And ultimately, how do you decide what is no longer relevant? Those are actually the much more interesting, and at least from a computer science perspective, those are the more interesting challenges. And I think what we're seeing when you go back to the data lakes, and I can draw analogies in other industries, but at the end of the day, I think all of this putting the data into one spot, really what it ended up doing was it was driven by regulatory reporting and very organized bodies that said we want to have this information all in one spot. And so I think there was this romantic concept that we'll put all the data in one place, and then you'll be able to ask any question about anything and just immediately have an answer. But there does need to be organization. I mean, there has to be thought that goes in how do you actually store this data, normalize it, and make it retrievable. And again, this is something that 3Forge really focuses on, is how do you take all this data, whether it's in one space or different spaces, and help people analyze it, look at the quality of data, and then be able to retrieve that and use it in a meaningful way to make these data-driven decisions.
I love it. We've had a lot of talk, right? We talk a lot around master data management, and we had a guest on that was talking around customer data management. Data management itself seems to be kind of an emerging science, right? We have data scientists, which is the coolest title in IT, I'm convinced, to be a data scientist. I just picture them with beakers of data, pouring it back and forth.
Oh, that's exactly what they do. Yes, they just have beakers filled with ones and zeros, and they're pouring them all day long. It's interesting. Yeah.
Smoke's rising. It's great. Yeah. But, it just seems to be that's the emerging space, right? It's like, stop collecting it and start managing the data in a meaningful way so that we can actually do something with it, really is the end result of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with collecting the data as long as it's being, to continue collecting this data, because eventually we'll find a way to use it. And actually, I think one thing that's interesting now is what we've also seen over the last 10 years as we focus on this problem is I think a lot of organizations are realizing that what we originally, I think if you had asked 15 years ago how people look at the data inside their organizations, they would say it was a cost. I mean, there's a cost to hard drives, there's a cost to infrastructure, there's a cost to personnel to manage that data. And then I think, now we're seeing that shift where people are realizing that data is actually an asset. So I don't think there's anything wrong with holding on to more data than you need. But again, I think that all that data is sitting there and it's not necessarily being tapped in certainly the most efficient way to make use of it. And I come back to, I really haven't covered this yet, but I actually look at data management. I break it into 3 buckets. I think the first bucket is the ability to actually have real-time data, and I think this is an important part of the data story, especially when you're talking about things like IoT or in finance when you want to do customer support, things like that. You touched on it before, which is like you go and you use your credit card. And so when I talk about real-time data, I'm talking about data that is actually flowing through your systems, and you need to be able to access that in a timely fashion. So that's the first bucket that we focus on. The analogy I actually like to draw there is sending emails. Like it's a trivial example, but you send an email and someone receives that email. You don't have to do anything. You're just watching your screen, staring at it, and then an email shows up. Right? That's what I would call real time data. The second thing is actually being able to ask a question about your data and get an answer back. And this is quite a complex topic, and we could fill quite a bit of time just talking about this. But the analogy I like to make there is you go to google.com and you type in a search and you get an answer back. You get a list and it says there's 20 million links that satisfy this query. But at the end of the day, that is a human asking a question and then getting data back to them, right, on
Mm-hmm.
as a response. So I think that's the second thing, and that's again what I think we've been focusing on a lot of the call. And then the third thing is data entry, and that's, I think, self-explanatory. The analogy I make there is actually writing an email and sending that off. But what I found is that if you cover those three things and you really think about those three problems, which is how do I manage my real-time moving data? How do I manage the ability to ask questions about my data? And how do I manage the ability to enter data and workflows around that data? That's actually really all there is to it. That is, you can throw just about any data use case at me, and I could position it so that it would fall into one or more of those three buckets. And I think that's something I always focus on when I'm working with my customers. Is it might seem like an overwhelming or daunting task, but if you can just take the problem and break it into these three buckets, then you can start to solve. You can start to solve it and make meaningful use out of it.
One of the coolest CIOs that I had a chance to work with, he said, I don't really care about my applications. I care about the data that's collected behind the scenes, right? And his thought process was all around databases. He's like, applications are just GUI interfaces for me to get entry and data. He's like, once I have data, that's where I can report, transact, interact, provide data at the point of where it's meaningful, not 30 days after, right? I can provide real-time management reporting and such, and tools for frontline managers to make decisions on the spot, leveraging current data, not like, oh, here's a financial report 30 days later. And you're like, wow, great, I sucked that month, but I can't do anything about it now. Oh, well, I'll try harder next month, right? Like that mindset has transitioned, I think, at the IT leadership level to really think about how do I get data in the hands of my customers, the business, right? Whatever business or industry you're in, at the point that it's immediately relevant and enables leadership or management or frontline staff to make a decision that changes the outcome in a positive way for whatever the business of the business is. And it was just really cool to see somebody think about that, because we were talking to him about applications and he's like, I could give two shoots about my applications, right? That's not where the magic is.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is if you architect things correctly, and I do think this is often a mistake, is that people integrate the data problem with the application problem. It's actually very easy to do, and it in a way, it kind of lets you get minimum viable products out the door faster if you don't really worry about separating the two. But the data application segregation is critical if you're trying to build an enterprise. And the example I can make is that if you go back to, a lot of times in finance, it would be heavyweight applications. And by heavyweight application, I mean a piece of software that gets installed on your desktop. And once you do that, you're now going down a very slippery slope, which is, okay, when the user starts to enter that data and work with that data, maybe we'll just keep it in this heavyweight application sitting on the desktop. And that's a really bad idea. Really, what you want to be doing is thinking of whatever the user's interacting with this application. It really should be a skin as thin as possible that is then servicing the back end. It's basically, again, I come back to, it's that interface between humans and the data. That's how I like to think of applications. So I would definitely agree with your CIO on that. And again, I think it's very, very easy, and it can sometimes shorten the development life cycle. in the short term, but in the long term, you end up paying huge consequences if you don't properly segregate those two concepts. Yeah.
I love it. We're in the application implementation space, right? As an integrator, that's really what our RPI does as a consulting firm. And I do a lot of strategy consulting around applications, right? And what I call application lifecycle management. Like let's understand our investment in applications. Let's understand what we're really asking them to do. How do they serve the business? What is the real cost, right? Like how much are we spending on it and how much value are we getting out of it? And oftentimes when you go through that exercise, people are like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, wow, we have a huge cost of finance applications serving that business. I didn't know that, right? Or the CFO will be like, oh, yeah, I use all these apps. I had no idea what they really cost me. And when they really understand that, they start making different decisions around their application space. And they're like, what they really, want is the data. They care far less about how they get the data or the application. It's got to be usable and meet the business need and such, obviously. But the application value becomes really the data, right? The data is the valuable part of what happens there. How so much of the IT budgets, which are getting squeezed, right? You look at all the stats, and everyone's trying to do more with less cost in IT, less people in IT. All this software, how can people change that equation, right? How can they, do more with less applications?
Well, this is how I look at it. And this is where I'm definitely going to plug our product, because this is exactly the sort of thing that I've been thinking about. And I go back to, I got my feet wet, I would say, in fintech at Bear Stearns. I also worked at JP Morgan. I was head of infrastructure at the Dark Pool Liquidnet. And all the while, I had this in my mind. Again, I've been writing software my whole life, so I had a pretty good understanding that you want to keep your application and your data completely separate. But what was striking is that, and by the way, I think the data part of it is very specific to the problem set. So if you're in airline industry, the way you're managing your data and the way you organize your data is probably pretty different than if you're managing financial transactions. I mean, they just have different schemas and things like that. I'm not going to say they're vastly different. You could put them both in databases, but a lot of work goes into how do you organize that data, how do you manage that data. However, I believe that the applications, especially from a support and inquisition, like being able to ask questions about your data, from that perspective, the applications are always very similar. And I come back to these three things. You either want to view real-time moving data, you want to be able to ask questions about your data, or you want to be able to do data entry. And so what I felt was that way too much time and money was being spent building applications. And I'm careful about the term application. I'm using it, I would say, in the precise sense when I think of a front end that allows users to access their data. A lot of money and time and effort goes into the applications. When I think all the intellectual property is actually sitting in the data and the way that data is organized. And so what our value proposition to these banks is, look, take your top talent, all your developers, and subject matter experts, have them focusing on how the systems interact, how the data is organized, how they can get value out of that data. And when it comes to building front-end applications, this is something that frankly can come off the shelf. And I believe, I think 3Forge is way ahead of the game in terms of the speed at which we can provide applications off the shelf that allow you to work with this. And we just keep pushing that envelope further and further as we move into more industries. But at the end of the day, again, you come back to what your CIO said, which is, it's about the data. I don't care about the applications. I would agree with that. And it's a bit of irony because I spend my life building the application part of it. But the reason I've done that is I feel that should be something that's commoditized. It doesn't matter whether, it doesn't make sense for each bank to be independently building the same application over and over again. You can come up with a common set of tools and a common set of principles, build a generic data agnostic application, and then configure it based on the data in the backend. So, like I said, I mean, when you ask that question, it falls right into what 3Forge focuses on.
Well, and I love a lot of what you just said. I have a lot of people tell me like, I have to have this application, and I'm like, is it a difference maker in your business, right? Like, because you use this budgeting solution or this, financial management tool, does it make the company have an advantage over your competitors? Does it? Well, no. Okay. Well, that's really the question, right? You should be asking, and not just like, I think people they get
Right.
sold, right? They get sold by application vendors, this application, and they spend a ton of money on it. And at the end of the day, I'm like, it's no different than this application. Like, you just spent more for it.
Right. It's tough because you see front ends. You can't
Yeah.
actually see data. I mean, if it's kind of a philosophical thing, but you can't really see data. You know what I mean? It has to be interpreted and displayed through a front end. I mean, whether it's a text editor or a fancy graphing product, and so when you try to sell the virtues of data and data organization, that's a more difficult sell to someone who hasn't spent their life in IT. It's
Yeah.
much easier to communicate the important, like the front end aspect of it. But I come back to, and actually, I will say, as a vendor, it does make our demos a lot of fun because we have front ends and we can show how you can see that data, and
Right.
it's very appealing to them. But I also, on a slightly different note, and I know I'm getting off topic a little bit here, but I think it's funny that we do these canned demos, but one thing we always assure our customers is, once you take this platform and you put it on your data, and you take a generic platform, one that wasn't written specifically for your problem set, and it wasn't written for you or for your company, and you take this generic application and you put it on top of your data, and then you see all the value from it, it helps them understand that it's actually the data. It wasn't the application. It was the data that had the value all along. And we're just trying to basically bring that out. And if you flip it around, let's say you said, okay, I've got all this data there. I really don't know what it is. And I'm going to go and hire a bunch of developers and spend, a few $1,000,000 and build an application from scratch across, some global thing, and spend lots of money on it. And then you see that data, you're attributing the success of the data to the huge team of developers that, frankly, it was a wasted effort to build this front end from scratch. But you start to attribute it to that. When in fact it's the data that's really the important piece.
It's so interesting, because why do we implement applications? When we go into customers, they talk about two things. They don't talk about like application and such. They talk about efficiency of a process, meaning they want to automate that and minimize that so they can reduce their FTE cost of using said application. And then they talk to us about reporting. Reporting is just a business term for data, right? They really want the value of the data, right? They don't go, and we really need this great looking, big, bulky application. Like, no one says that, right? They're really talking about, I really want an input tool that's highly efficient so that I can get to the data and have meaningful insights into my business.
Exactly.
Really. And then what we do is we pomp and circumstance and fluff that application space. There's a ton of money spent on that application space, and I'm always like, why are we doing this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I really think that it is it's a $1 trillion industry that, if done right, doesn't need to exist. This industry of building all of these front ends over and over again from scratch. And I just really believe that at the core. And
Yeah.
that's and to me, again, I've built front ends for middle office, back office, front office for high frequency trading. I built these at multiple different organizations in the capacity of being an employee, of being a project manager, of being a consultant. And sometimes the buttons are curvier than other times, and the input fields are here versus there, and the shadows are different or whatever. But they're really, it's just it doesn't, the commonality far outweighs the differences between these things, and it was really that I felt as though I was wasting my time, not just my employer's time. I always look at it as, if you do your job right as a software engineer and you do it to perfection, you shouldn't have to do it again. But I felt myself constantly building and rebuilding and rebuilding, when, I felt like if you really focused on it and did it right. And by the way, there's a lot of challenges in trying to make a generic architecture that's data agnostic and can solve these things. But, that's the interesting challenge that I love. And again, I think it just comes down to saving tons of money and tons of time. And I think that's another unsung savings when you don't decide to build applications from scratch, and instead you use an existing platform like ours, and instead customize it. Because when you build something from scratch and then the data changes, which inevitably it's going to. The data, when I say the data, I mean the data schema. When the underlying data schema changes or grows, or you end up doing an M&A, merger acquisition, or something like that, then inevitably the front end needs to change. And the question is, does that mean you have to go back to, a team of developers and ask them to do lots of work to change the front end or change the application to match the data? Or is that something you can do with relative ease by just simply configuring a dashboard? And I believe it should definitely be the latter of the two.
Yeah. I tell companies all the time, right? The most common thing I get is people go, well, we're different. And I'm like, you're not different. Popping your bubble, you're not different. You're really not. At the end of the day, right? Everybody has an HR department. You need to manage your employees. It's no different than any other company and any other industry. Finance is the same thing.
Yeah.
A GL entry is a GL entry is a GL entry. Like those back office systems, especially, it's the same shit, rinse and repeat over and over again. I don't care if you go to fancy, expensive Workday, Oracle, Infor, SAP, pick it, and then you spend all this time implementing and configuring and stuff. And if I compared two companies on different coasts, they'd have minute differences at the end of their $20 million journeys.
Right. And I think, that's something that comes with maturity and experience. And, I think now, if you talk to people that are a little bit newer in an organization, they'll often think that the problems they're facing are unique. But if you talk to a senior manager that's been all over Wall Street, they recognize that it doesn't matter where you go. The problems are fairly common. There's always like an interesting twist based on the nuances of how things originated, but generally speaking, the problems are far more similar than they are different as you go from company to company. And as a vendor, I've now interacted with pretty much all the top tier 1 banks. The top 20, and talk to them about the problems they had and the sorts of solutions they're looking for. And there's always a lot of similarity. And yes, we often get they have this notion that somehow they're faced with this problem and their peers aren't, but it's just not the case. Yeah.
Well, yeah. It's interesting. People also, when we talk about application performance, right? That's the other thing we get is they want to move the big shift from applications being on-prem, and they want to move it to the cloud, right? So they're like, oh, I'm going to move to the cloud, because they get sold that. They get sold that the cloud is better, faster, cheaper. The cloud is just somebody else's computer. Newsflash, there you go. Burst that bubble. And then they always talk about, my applications need to be faster, right? And they need performance. Why do applications, why aren't they faster? Especially with all the advances in hardware and all the, we got DDR5 RAM now, and we're doing all this crazy advancements in hardware, and apps still struggle.
Right. Well, I'll tell you my opinion. And I think it has a lot to do with Moore's, I call it Moore's phenomenon, not Moore's law, because it's not a law. It was a temporary phenomenon. But I'll tell you why I have this belief, and I actually, I think our generation, in part, was part of the problem. So I'll tell a story to kind of go back when I really got into computers in the beginning, and there wasn't a whole lot of resources available, especially for someone who's living in a small town. And I was really into programming, and so what I would do is I would actually get access to the source code for commands like grep and cat. These are like core Linux commands. And I would look at the way this code was written. And you could tell that these developers understood that every byte matters. And that, you're dealing with 1 or 2 kilohertz machines or less when they were writing these things, right? So every instruction that the computer had to execute was time. And so really a ton of thought went in, how do you make these commands as fast as possible? And they optimized and optimized and optimized it to death. And they looked for every edge case you possibly could to try to eke out a little bit more performance. And by the way, performance, let's put it this way, performance is actually just, computers are very fast now. So really when we're talking about performance, all we're really talking about is efficiency. So, I guess the flip side is when we say something isn't performant, we're really just saying it isn't efficient. The code wasn't written efficient. Now, here's the problem. There was a period of time where people were focused so much on making code as fast as possible that they ended up doing, I guess, what you could call premature optimizations, things along those lines. And then this entire discipline that came out of like academia was that avoid premature optimizations, focus on code structure. And all these things make sense and are good, but not at the cost of slower computers. But if you were to flip that around and you were in the 90s and you really believed this tale that computers were just going to double in speed every 1 to 2 years in perpetuity, then why does it matter? You can write the slowest and most unoptimized code ever. And all you got to do is, wait 1 or 2 years and the hardware will catch up with you. And that was true for a long time. And so software engineers, I think, that were learning to code in the 90s and 2000s just felt as though, really it didn't matter if you wrote optimized code or not. And I've always been under the opinion that I've always been the opposite, which is I felt like code you need when you're writing a piece of software, the cost of developer time to make that software more efficient, to look for those edge conditions, that's a one-time hit. The software engineer, if they have to sit there for 2 days instead of 1 day to make that software efficient, that's a one-time hit. But then every time someone uses that software and every time you have to deploy a new server and all of that stuff, that's just a reoccurring cost that you save in perpetuity, to go back to that term. So I think that really, it isn't that. There's definitely opportunity to write much, much more optimized code than I think we have been doing. And then on the flip side, I would agree with what you're saying, which is that everyone's always looking for higher performance systems. And in my opinion is, I actually, when I started the platform, that was my main focus, on scalability and performance. Because one thing I've seen forever is that systems are limited by their performance ultimately. And it's people will, if you make a system so it can handle 500 users, you'll get to 500 users. If you make a system that can handle 2,000 users, you'll get to 2,000 users. If you can make a system that'll handle 20 million, it'll get to 20 million. So my point is that, if you build the software in a expandable way, people will eventually take advantage of it. And on the flip side, if you make it narrow scope and the idea is just to get a minimum viable product out the door, it will come to bite you later on. So I think it's always about trying to be as optimized as possible when you're writing these systems in the first place. And that's coming back to, I think, what I learned when I was building these high frequency trading systems, back in the early 2000s.
Yeah. If you want a competitive advantage, right, that to me is the competitive advantage, right? The impatience of our end users of any application, right, is that inefficiency where they're waiting. on the application.
Right. We actually did. So there's a company called Stack Research, and they basically are kind of the good housekeeping in finance. So they're an independent body. You can give them, yeah, I know it seems good housekeeping in finance. Well, that doesn't exist. No, but I should say good housekeeping in fintech. I should be more exact with my wording. But basically what they do is, you can come to them with a new system and they will basically do a performance test. So we came to them, we said, look, we have the fastest dashboards and the fastest user interface there is. And they basically ran through the tests. And yes, we are number one. We are the fastest, 2 million rows in a table, millions of points in a chart. We are the fastest. They basically give out the stats and you can read for yourself. We're basically at the top. And a lot of times what's funny is when we initially do the sales pitch, it's, well, why does performance matter? And it's like, you just wait. Just wait till you start to get a lot of users on the system. And as you start to add more data, it will matter.
It does. So you guys are all over crypto and fintech right now. Where do you see 3Forge going, right? Just as we do a lot of work in healthcare, right? And in healthcare, in certain aspects, milliseconds matter, right? It's a difference between life and death. It's, I always say, like, man, we're collecting a ton of clinical data about patients. Are we being preemptive? Are we transforming that patient's lives? When something happens, are we firing off the right notifications to get the right skill sets bedside to save that patient? And right now, sorry Epic, sorry Cerner, sorry Allscripts, I'd say the answer is no, right? We're still very reliant on a human to notice something and take action. When I listen to kind of what 3Forge does, I'm like, man, we could ingest all this data real time and really immediately transact on it, not in a fintech sense, but in a let's go save lives sense, right? Like let's look for these things that we've identified. We know this data means this person's about to have a cardiac event. Let's do something about it, like now while it's happening.
Right, and I think for better or worse, originally when I started my career, I was kind of into making video games and things like that. I was out in California for a little while working on more Silicon Valley type of projects. And I actually kind of looked down in the finance industry, like, well, that seems pretty boring. I mean, all you're doing is like moving people's money around. But then when I got into it, I realized it's actually about the most interesting challenge there is. Because what you're talking about is moving information in really large volumes. And it has to be done with 100% accuracy. And it has to happen very fast. So I call it the 3 V's: volume, and velocity, and what's the third V? I'm killing myself now. And well, it's accuracy, validity, volume, volume, velocity, and validity, right?
Makes
the 3
sense.
V's.
Yep.
And so, it actually it's putting those three together that makes it a real challenge. One thing is to deal with large volumes of data. That's tough. If you need to deal with large volumes of data and you have to have 100% accuracy or validity, that makes it more difficult. But now if you have to also do it really fast, that's the trifecta of a really interesting problem. And what I felt is by basically solving the 3 V's, with these fintech companies, it really, really well positions us to work in other industries. And that's why, I think the next most logical industry for us was crypto and IoT. But that certainly doesn't mean healthcare, insurance. Those are on the very short list of the next industries that we're now talking to as well. Because what we kind of started the conversation off with is, I think fintech is the canary in the coal mine. I mean, they are the first ones to deal with a lot of these things because they've been using computers longer than everyone else. But all these other industries are just going to end up in the same space, and they're going to need the same type of solutions. And it does. And I do think it's interesting that there's a lot of pieces of software that are built for a particular industry. And I always kind of, it's like, well, if you believe what I believe, which is that, a good solution is a data agnostic solution, and you should really look at problems at their root, not at the surface, then if you write a good piece of software, it should be industry agnostic.
I love it. Yeah. So I've got to ask, right? What was your first computer?
My first computer was an Amstrad. And
Wow.
it definitely had. I remember it had less memory than the floppy disk. I couldn't read the whole floppy disk in it. It was less than 512K, and it was it was a very slow 8086. But it came with 2 floppy drives. They had a promotion, so I got 2 5.25-inch floppy drives, which was nice because now you can copy from disk to disk directly.
Yeah, I had a Commodore 64, right? And then I
Nice.
upgraded to an Amiga, and I thought I was like,
Amigas are nice.
I
Yeah.
was at the top on an Amiga, So
Yeah.
it started us all off, right?
But it's,
It got us hooked
honestly,
on tech.
I know I'm just now sounding like this old timer telling, the next generations what's wrong. But I really think actually learning how to use a computer at the basics like that is really the way to go. I almost feel bad when I see little kids on these on their iPhones with touchscreens and everything. They have no idea how any of this works behind the scenes. And I feel very fortunate that frankly, I'm not going to say I know every little detail, but I have a pretty good understanding of how computers work. And I think that's a very valuable thing as you try to build these complex systems. Yeah.
I 100% agree. I mean, I'm watching my kids. I have 2 kids in college right now. And, my daughter was taking computer science, and she was like, well, why, her introduction to computer systems or something. And she was like, why do I need to know this? And I'm like, you're using something you don't understand, right? Like you don't understand like what's happening in that box. There's value to understanding what goes on in that box, right? I encouraged all my kids when they wanted computers. I'm like, great, we're going to build one.
Right.
And they were like, why? I'm like, because I want you to understand all these components and how they interact to bring this thing to life. Because if any of it is off, like you get the wrong chipset for your motherboard, like it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have this kind of silly test I ask myself a lot, which is, maybe a lot of people ask themselves this, but it's if you got thrown back, thousands of years ago and you have all the knowledge you have today and you're around this community, how much of it could you actually explain that would be useful to them? So for example, if all you know how to use is a smartphone, you could tell the village that you end up in that, well, in the future, there's these great smartphones that but then they're like, well, how does any of that work? And it's actually of no value. Right. But understanding things like math, that you could actually go back to a village tens of thousands of years ago and have a fighting chance at explaining math and what it does. And you could help accelerate their technology footprint. If you understand electromagnetism, things like that. And so I do think there's something to be said to be able to start at the ground and be able to build something interesting from its foundations. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I can design an integrated circuit. No, but I think it is important at some level to actually have these kind of basic understanding. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah. The inputs to the end results, right? We get so overwhelmed by the glitz and the glamour of our iPhones and our Androids and our Google phones. And we're like, this thing's amazing. I have no idea how it works, but it's amazing,
Yeah. And they're amazing.
Well, awesome. Well, Robert, thank you for taking the time, man. We covered Internet of Things. We covered a lot about data, which is such a hot button topic right now. Everyone's trying to understand data. We know that 3Forge is doing a lot in fintech right now. If other companies like are interested, I assume the website's the best place to kind of understand the product and get in contact.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely check out our website. We've got contact information on there. 3Forge, our LinkedIn profile for 3Forge.com is definitely where we're posting lots of updates. We try to do 1 to 2 a week, different data systems we connect to, different philosophies and different techniques around how to organize and access data, things like that. So it's a very rich, lively forum that we've got going there. So definitely I'd ask your listeners to follow us on LinkedIn's 3Forge
I love
social
it.
media. Yeah.
Fintech usually has the money to lead the way, right? So I very much see this as something that's coming to other industries. And if you want a competitive advantage, I always say being that early adopter is the way to do it, right? Reach out, understand the technology, stop being afraid of the tech. Right, the tech is really enabled by founders like yourself to solve a business problem, to enable companies to be better for the end result, which is to their customers, right? Whether those be fintech customers or healthcare or who knows where you guys will go. But this is very, very cool. I didn't even know what an Amstrad was. I just had to look it up, which is very, very cool as well. So I just learned about a new early computer.
Now I'm going to have to go look it up. I'm glad I could remember the name, but that was like my baby for a long time. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I remember when my dad brought home the Commodore 64 from a company called Montgomery Ward. It's a retailer that's not even around anymore. Mm-hmm. And it was very, very cool. I was very excited, and I love that thing. And yeah, we had external floppy drives and all kinds of craziness. So, well, thanks for what you're doing in the tech space. Starting a company is not an easy thing. We didn't really get into your founder journey, but a founder is essentially a fancy title for chief bottle washer, and you get to do a little bit of everything from yes. funding rounds and product development and hiring and developing a team and serving customers and such. So very cool. Mm-hmm. And thanks for taking time to be on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael.